Keep that camera running. Danielle Brooks said it with such controlled certainty that Officer Caleb Morgan instinctively glanced at the red light glowing on his chest. Rain tapped softly against the roof of the patrol car, and the wet Detroit pavement reflected alternating streaks of red and blue beneath their feet. Sergeant Mark Reynolds stood less than 6 feet from Danielle, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on the black woman beside the dark sedan as though he had already decided what she was before asking a single useful question. "Hands where I can see them," he ordered. Danielle slowly raised both hands. She did not argue. She did not step toward him. But her eyes never left his. Something about her calmness irritated Reynolds. People he stopped usually explained themselves, protested, apologized, or became nervous. Danielle did none of those things. "Why am I being detained?" she asked. Reynolds ignored the question and pointed toward the plain black bag hanging from her shoulder. "Put that down." Danielle's fingers tightened slightly around the strap. That tiny movement changed his expression. "I said put it down." Morgan watched from several feet away, rain gathering along the brim of his patrol cap. Dispatch had reported a woman possibly connected to a stolen vehicle somewhere nearby, but the description was broad, and the license plate in front of them did not match the one transmitted over the radio. Morgan had already noticed. Reynolds had not asked him. Danielle lowered the bag carefully beside her shoe. "Call your supervisor before you go any further." Reynolds gave a short, humorless laugh. "You think you are in a position to give instructions?" Danielle looked toward Morgan's body camera for only a second. "I think everyone here is in a position to follow procedure." The words landed quietly. Reynolds stepped closer, his patience visibly thinning. Danielle could have ended the confusion immediately. One credential case hidden beneath her jacket could have changed the entire tone of the street. But less than 20 minutes earlier, she had been watching the rear entrance of a warehouse connected to a federal investigation that had taken months to build. Somewhere nearby, a man her team had followed across 3 states might still be watching the block. Revealing herself publicly could burn the operation before sunrise. Reynolds saw hesitation where there was calculation. "What is in the bag?" "Personal property." "Open it." "No." Morgan's attention sharpened. Reynolds stared at her. "No." Danielle's voice remained even. "You do not have my consent to search it." A car rolled through the intersection, tires whispering over wet asphalt. Across the street, a customer inside the convenience store had stopped near the window to watch. Reynolds looked briefly toward the glass, then back at Danielle. People with nothing to hide usually cooperate. Danielle held his gaze. People with authority still need a reason. Morgan felt the tension change. Reynolds reached toward his belt, not with panic but with the deliberate motion of a man convinced the next decision belonged entirely to him. Danielle saw it and spoke immediately. "Sergeant, do not turn a mistake into something permanent." Reynolds paused. "Last warning." Danielle did not move. Morgan looked again at his body camera. Still recording. Then Reynolds gave him an order that would matter far more than anyone on that street understood. "Turn that camera off." Morgan froze. Danielle's eyes shifted to him. "Do not." Caleb Morgan did not touch the camera. The red light stayed on. For a moment, the only sound on the street was rain ticking against metal and the low idle of the patrol car. Mark Reynolds looked at the younger officer with disbelief. "I gave you an order." Caleb swallowed. "Department policy says we keep recording during an active detention." Reynolds turned back toward Danielle Brooks, and something in his expression hardened. "You happy now?" Danielle did not answer the question. "Run my plate again. Run my license. Compare me to the description you were given." Caleb glanced toward the patrol car. "I already checked the plate. It is registered to her." Reynolds looked at him sharply. "And no stolen vehicle hit. No warrants." Danielle slowly lowered her hands only after Reynolds motioned for her to do so. "Then what exactly are you?" "Investigating." Reynolds stepped toward the black bag resting near her shoe. "That depends on what you are carrying." Danielle moved 1 foot beside the bag, not blocking him, but making the boundary clear. "You still do not have consent to search it." Reynolds exhaled through his nose. You keep saying that like you memorized a script. I keep saying it because the answer has not changed. Caleb looked down at the mobile data terminal inside the cruiser. The dispatch notes were still visible. Female suspect. Dark jacket. Possible connection to a vehicle reported stolen several blocks away. Height estimate approximately 5 feet 7 inches. Danielle was closer to 5 feet 10. The reported vehicle was a light-colored compact car. Danielle stood beside a dark sedan. Even the direction of travel did not fit. Caleb stepped closer to Reynolds. Sergeant, the description is weak. Reynolds kept his eyes on Danielle. People change cars. The plate is clean. Plates get switched. Danielle watched the exchange carefully. There it was. Every fact that should have reduced suspicion was being reshaped to preserve it. She had seen the same logic in interrogation transcripts. When evidence challenged a conclusion, the conclusion simply expanded to swallow the evidence. What is your name? Reynolds asked. Danielle Brooks. Identification. Danielle reached slowly toward her coat pocket. Reynolds immediately lifted a hand. Slow. She stopped, waited, then removed her driver's license with 2 fingers and held it out. Caleb took it and returned to the patrol car. The routine search produced exactly what Danielle expected. Valid license. Current registration. Clean record. No alerts. Nothing that explained why she was standing on a wet Detroit street after 11 o'clock with a black bag she would not allow them to open. Nothing that revealed what she had been doing 20 minutes earlier. At 11:18 that night, Danielle had been parked across from a warehouse near the river, pretending to check messages while monitoring a rear-loading entrance. Her team had spent nearly 6 months tracing a network tied to stolen identities, fraudulent accounts, and confidential data moving through shell companies across Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois. The men expected at the warehouse that night had disappeared twice before when law enforcement activity got too close. Danielle's cover depended on looking ordinary. No marked vehicle. No visible badge. No conversation that could be overheard and repeated. The black bag at her feet contained nothing illegal, but some of its contents could identify an active target and expose the next meeting point. One careless reveal could send months of work into darkness. Caleb returned and handed the license to Reynolds. Everything is clear. Reynolds studied Danielle's face. Then why are you acting like that bag contains state secrets? Danielle almost reacted to the irony, but stopped herself. I am acting like someone who knows her rights. Reynolds bent slightly toward the bag. And I am acting like someone trying to figure out why you are so protective of it. Danielle's voice became quieter. Those are not the same thing. Caleb looked at Reynolds. We could call the watch commander and sort this out. Reynolds gave him a cold look. You suddenly need permission to do police work? Caleb hesitated. Danielle saw the conflict immediately. He knew the facts were slipping away from Reynolds, but challenging a senior officer was different from noticing that he was wrong. Reynolds pointed toward the hood of the patrol car. Put the bag there. Danielle did not move. Am I free to leave? Reynolds answered without hesitation. No. Then state the reason for the detention. He paused. Caleb noticed. Danielle noticed. Even the customer behind the convenience store window seemed to lean closer. Reynolds finally said, possible connection to an active vehicle investigation. Danielle nodded once. Then investigate the vehicle. Her eyes shifted toward the clean license in Caleb's hand. You already did. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it exposed something Reynolds could no longer hide behind procedure. He was not waiting for evidence to tell him what happened. He was waiting for evidence to agree with what he had already decided. Reynolds stared at Danielle for a moment longer, then reached down and lifted the black bag from the pavement. If there is nothing in here, this ends quickly. Danielle's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Put it back. Caleb looked at her, then at Reynolds. The request had come without panic, but there was something new in her voice now, something sharper than before. Reynolds noticed it too. There it is, he said. That is what I have been waiting for. Danielle kept both hands visible. What you are seeing is concern about your judgment, not guilt. Reynolds placed the bag on the hood of the patrol car and opened the zipper. Caleb moved closer. Sergeant, we should slow this down. Reynolds ignored him. Inside the bag were ordinary things arranged with unusual care: a phone, a small notebook, a hotel key card, a folded street map, and a sealed envelope marked only with a date and time. Reynolds picked up the envelope. Danielle's jaw tightened. Do not open that. He looked at her. Why? Because you do not know what you are touching. Then explain it. I cannot. Caleb's eyes shifted between them. The rain had thinned to mist, and somewhere behind the convenience store a delivery truck reversed with a faint electronic beeping sound. Everything felt strangely normal around a situation that was becoming less normal by the second. Reynolds turned the envelope over in his hand. You refuse to explain where you were going, who you were meeting, and what is in your bag. You understand how that looks. Danielle answered immediately. I understand how you have chosen to make it look. Caleb lowered his voice. Sergeant, her car is clean. Her license is clean. The suspect description does not match well. We can call a supervisor before we go through personal property. Reynolds looked at him with open irritation. I have been doing this longer than you have been wearing that uniform. Caleb did not answer. Reynolds turned back to Danielle. You know what your problem is. Danielle held his gaze. You stopped investigating 10 minutes ago. His expression hardened. Excuse me. You decided who I was first. Now every answer has to fit that decision. The sentence sat between them. Caleb looked away, not because he disagreed, but because he knew she had said aloud what he had been thinking. Reynolds placed the envelope back on the hood but kept one hand over it. I know what I am looking at. Danielle's eyes narrowed slightly. No. You know what you expected to find. Across the street, the customer inside the convenience store was still holding a phone toward the window. Caleb noticed another camera mounted beneath the store awning, angled directly toward the patrol car. Reynolds noticed neither. Danielle did. She catalogued the angles automatically. Body camera. Store camera. Traffic signal camera 30 yards east. 2 civilian witnesses. Her training had turned observation into instinct long before tonight. Reynolds reached into the bag again and removed the disposable phone. Who does this belong to? Me. Why do you need 2 phones? That is not relevant to the vehicle report. I will decide what is relevant. Danielle drew a slow breath. In less than 40 minutes, she was supposed to confirm whether the men at the warehouse had moved to a second location near the river. That phone was part of the contact chain. If Reynolds powered it on, dialed numbers, or exposed its contents where anyone could see, the operation might not simply fail. People who had quietly cooperated with federal investigators could become visible. She could reveal herself. The credential case beneath her jacket could stop him. But she looked past Reynolds toward the dark second-floor windows across the intersection and remembered why she was dressed like an ordinary civilian in the first place. Her target had disappeared before because somebody had noticed law enforcement where it was not supposed to be. Danielle lowered her voice. Sergeant Reynolds, call your supervisor. He gave a thin smile. Still trying that? Yes. Why? Danielle looked directly at him. Because I am giving you every possible chance to make the next decision correctly. Caleb's attention sharpened. Reynolds stepped closer. You think you are smarter than everyone standing here? Danielle shook her head. No. I think facts should be smarter than all of us. For the first time, Caleb almost smiled, but the moment vanished when Reynolds pointed toward the patrol car. Turn around. Danielle did not move. Am I under arrest? You are being detained while we sort this out. Then sort it out with your supervisor present. Reynolds glanced at Caleb's body camera and saw the red light still glowing. I told you to turn that thing off. Caleb's hand remained at his side. I am keeping it on. Reynolds stared at him. Danielle watched the 2 officers, and suddenly the real conflict on that street was no longer only between her and Reynolds. Caleb had reached his own decision point. Procedure or pressure? Record or loyalty? Reynolds looked back at Danielle. Last chance to cooperate. Danielle's answer came quietly. I have been cooperating. I just have not been surrendering my rights. Reynolds held Danielle's gaze for several seconds, then looked down at the black bag on the hood of the patrol car. You keep talking about rights, but you still have not explained what you are doing here. Danielle answered without hesitation. Because I am not required to explain my entire life to prove that I belong on this street. Caleb shifted slightly, uncomfortable with how far the stop had drifted from the original vehicle report. Reynolds picked up the sealed envelope again. Then maybe this explains it. Danielle's expression sharpened. Put it down. Or what? Or you may compromise something you cannot repair. Reynolds gave a short laugh. There it is again. Another warning. Danielle remained still. You keep hearing threats because you have already decided I am dangerous. The words landed harder than Reynolds expected. He looked toward Caleb as if waiting for support, but the younger officer said nothing. The red light on his body camera continued blinking. Reynolds turned the envelope beneath the patrol lights, studying the plain exterior. No logo. No address. Just a handwritten time. Danielle watched every movement. Her mind was already calculating possibilities. If Reynolds opened it here, the names and location inside could become visible to anyone nearby. If she revealed her credentials, the operation could survive this moment but fail before morning. She glanced again toward the dark windows across the street. Somewhere beyond the reflections and rain, someone might still be watching. Sergeant, Caleb said carefully, we have enough to call the watch commander. Reynolds did not look at him. We do not need the watch commander every time someone refuses to answer a question. This is not just a question anymore. Caleb's voice was quieter now, but steadier. Reynolds finally turned. What are you saying? Caleb looked at the clean license in his hand, then at Danielle's registered sedan. I am saying the original reason for the stop is falling apart. Silence. Danielle said nothing. She did not need to. Reynolds looked back at her, and for the first time there was something underneath his irritation that looked like uncertainty. But uncertainty lasted only a moment. Pride moved in behind it. Fine, he said. If she wants to make this difficult, we will finish it at the station. Danielle's eyes narrowed. On what basis? Reynolds answered, obstruction while we determine what is going on. Caleb immediately looked at him. Sergeant. Reynolds raised a hand. Enough. Danielle took a slow breath. Say it clearly for the camera. Reynolds stared at her. You really think that camera is going to save you? Danielle looked toward Caleb's chest. I think it may save the truth. The convenience store customer was still recording from behind the glass. A second person now stood near the doorway, watching from a distance. Reynolds noticed them and lowered his voice. Turn around. Danielle did not move immediately. Am I under arrest? You are being taken in while we sort this out. That is not an answer. Reynolds's jaw tightened. Turn around. Danielle slowly complied, keeping her movements controlled and visible. Caleb stepped forward, but before he reached her, Danielle spoke to him. Officer Morgan, keep recording. Caleb nodded once. Reynolds heard it. I already told you to shut it off. Caleb looked directly at his supervisor. And I told you policy requires it to stay on. Something changed in the space between them. For the first time that night, Reynolds was no longer facing one person, challenging his judgment. His own partner was now refusing to erase the record. Danielle heard the faint rustle of radio traffic from the cruiser. Another unit was asking for location confirmation somewhere across the district. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary procedure. That was what made the moment feel so strange. Nothing dramatic had to happen for a mistake to become serious. Sometimes all it took was one person refusing to reconsider, then another person deciding whether to speak. Reynolds picked up Danielle's bag from the hood. We are done talking. Danielle turned her head slightly toward him. No. You are done listening. Caleb looked down for a moment, then back at the body camera. Still recording. Reynolds opened the rear door of the patrol car. Danielle stepped toward it without resistance. Just before getting inside, she looked at Reynolds one last time. Call your supervisor now, while this can still be explained as a mistake. Reynolds shook his head. You are not in charge here. Danielle sat down and looked through the open door at him. That is exactly why you should be careful. The patrol car door closed, and for the first time that night Danielle was separated from the street by glass and metal. Caleb remained outside for a moment, speaking quietly with Reynolds near the trunk. Danielle could not hear every word, but she did not need to. Caleb's posture told her enough. He was questioning the decision. Reynolds was defending it. Rain traced thin lines down the rear window, bending the red and blue lights into long streaks across Danielle's reflection. She kept her breathing slow. The black bag sat in the front seat now, close enough to see but too far to protect. Reynolds climbed behind the wheel. Caleb entered the passenger side and checked his body camera again. The red light remained on. Reynolds noticed. You are still recording. Caleb answered without looking at him. Yes. Reynolds started the engine. Fine. His voice made it clear that nothing about this felt fine. The cruiser pulled away from the curb. For several blocks nobody spoke. Detroit moved past in wet storefronts, traffic signals, and apartment windows glowing above dark sidewalks. Danielle watched the city through the glass and counted minutes. Her next operational check-in was approaching. If she missed it, someone from her team would notice. That was reassuring, but not enough. The investigation was still exposed through the bag sitting less than 4 feet in front of her. Reynolds glanced at Danielle through the rearview mirror. You are awfully calm for somebody being taken to the station. Danielle met his eyes in the reflection. Would being afraid make you believe me? Caleb turned slightly in his seat. Reynolds said nothing. The question remained inside the vehicle longer than any answer could have. Danielle looked back toward the passing streetlights. You know, Reynolds finally said, this could have ended 10 minutes ago if you had just cooperated. Danielle's voice stayed level. I gave you my license. I answered questions about the vehicle. I followed your instructions. You refused the bag. I refused a search. Caleb looked toward the windshield. Reynolds tightened his hands around the steering wheel. Same difference when someone is hiding something. Danielle looked at his reflection again. No. That difference is the entire reason procedure exists. Reynolds shook his head. You really enjoy lecturing police officers. I enjoy accuracy. Caleb lowered his gaze, almost hiding a reaction. Reynolds noticed. Something funny? No, Sergeant. Another mile passed. Danielle glanced toward the black bag. The sealed envelope was still inside. Reynolds had not opened it. That mattered. Her greater concern now was the disposable phone. If anyone began exploring its contacts or messages at the station, questions could spread beyond the room before she had a safe opportunity to identify herself. She needed control without revealing why. Officer Morgan, she said. Caleb turned. Yes. When we arrive, I want the bag inventoried without anything being opened until a supervisor is present. Reynolds answered before Caleb could. You do not set conditions. I am making a request for the record. Caleb nodded slowly. I heard you. Reynolds looked toward him. Do not encourage this. Caleb's expression tightened. I am. Acknowledging what she said. Silence again. Danielle watched the young officer and understood that the most important decision of his night had already happened. He had kept the camera on. Everything after that could be questioned, reviewed, reconstructed. Without the recording, the story would depend on memory and authority. With it, the facts had another witness. The cruiser turned toward downtown. Danielle looked at the dashboard clock reflected faintly in the partition. 11:37. Her check-in was 2 minutes away. She had no way to make it. Reynolds broke the silence. When we get there, you are going to tell us who you were meeting. Danielle answered, no. Still refusing. Still protecting information you do not need. Protecting from who? Danielle looked directly at him through the mirror. Right now. From you. Caleb's head turned sharply. Reynolds gave a short laugh, but there was no amusement in it. You think you are important enough that someone is coming for you? Danielle looked at the clock again. 11:39. Her check-in window had just closed. Somewhere in another part of the city, a secure phone would remain silent when it was supposed to ring. Someone would notice. Danielle leaned back against the seat. I think somebody just realized I am missing. The cruiser entered the station lot at 11:47, and Danielle watched the building grow larger through the rain-streaked glass. 8 minutes had passed since her missed check-in. That was enough. Somewhere across Detroit, Thomas Grant would already be comparing her last known location with the surveillance plan, trying to determine whether silence meant technical trouble or something worse. Reynolds parked near the rear entrance and turned off the engine. We are here. Danielle looked at the black bag in the front seat. Remember what I said about the contents? Reynolds opened his door. You have said plenty. Caleb stepped out first and waited while Reynolds opened the rear door. Danielle emerged into the cold drizzle, her posture still controlled despite the long night. The station smelled faintly of wet concrete and coffee when they entered. Fluorescent. Lights flattened every color in the lobby. A desk officer looked up from a computer as Reynolds approached with the bag. What do we have? Reynolds placed it on the counter. Possible obstruction during a vehicle investigation. She would not cooperate with the search. Danielle spoke before the desk officer could respond. I declined consent. My license and vehicle were both clear. The officer looked at Caleb. Caleb hesitated, then nodded. That is correct. Reynolds gave him a hard glance. There were additional circumstances. What circumstances? The desk officer asked. Reynolds tapped the bag. That is what we are trying to determine. Danielle looked toward the wall clock. 11:50. I am requesting a supervisor before anyone opens that bag. The desk officer studied her. You asked for one already. Caleb answered. Several times. That changed the man's expression. Not dramatically, but enough for Danielle to notice. He reached for the phone. Reynolds stepped closer. We do not need to turn this into a production. If somebody requests the watch commander repeatedly during a disputed search, I would rather make the call. Reynolds said nothing. Danielle was taken to a small interview room 10 feet down the hallway. Caleb removed the restraints according to station procedure and placed them on the table. Danielle sat in the metal chair and rubbed her wrists once before folding her hands in front of her. The room contained almost nothing: 2 chairs, a gray table, a narrow window, and a clock whose second hand sounded louder than it should have. Caleb remained at the doorway. Do you need water? Yes, please. He returned with a paper cup. Danielle took it. Thank you. Caleb glanced toward the hallway. Reynolds stood near the booking counter, speaking quietly with the desk officer. The black bag remained between them. Who are you? Caleb asked. Danielle looked up. You already ran my name. That is not what I mean. I know. He lowered his voice. You knew exactly what to say out there. You watched every camera. You knew when the stop stopped making sense. Danielle took a small drink of water. Everyone should know when a stop stops making sense. Caleb did not smile. You also keep checking the time. Danielle looked at the clock again. 11:55. Someone expected to hear from me 16 minutes ago. Caleb's expression shifted. Family. No. Employer. Danielle did not answer. Caleb looked through the narrow window toward the black bag. Is whatever is in there connected to your job? Danielle met his eyes. Officer Morgan, the best thing you can do right now is make sure nobody opens that envelope. Why? Because there are people outside this building who could be affected by what is inside. Caleb stared at her for a moment. You keep saying things like that. Because they remain true. Outside the room, Reynolds unzipped the bag again. Danielle saw the movement through the glass and stood immediately. Sergeant Reynolds. He looked toward her. Do not open it. Reynolds lifted the sealed envelope and held it under the fluorescent light. You have had plenty of opportunities to tell us what this is. And you have had plenty of opportunities to call your supervisor. Caleb stepped into the hallway. Sergeant, the watch commander is on the way. Reynolds turned the envelope over. Then he can watch. Danielle's voice became lower. If you break that seal, you may expose people who do not know this stop even happened. Reynolds looked at her through the glass. Who are these people? I cannot tell you. Convenient. Danielle did not react. Her eyes moved to the clock. 11:58. 19 minutes late. Then the telephone at the front desk rang. The desk officer answered with his attention still on Reynolds. Central desk. He listened. His posture changed almost immediately. Yes, she is here. Reynolds slowly lowered the envelope. Caleb looked toward Danielle. The desk officer listened for several more seconds, then turned directly toward Reynolds. Sergeant. Reynolds frowned. What? The officer covered the receiver with one hand. You need to put that envelope down. Reynolds stared at him. Why? The desk officer's eyes moved toward Danielle, and when he spoke again, every trace of routine had vanished from his voice. Because the Federal Bureau of Investigation is asking why we have one of their people in custody. The station seemed to go silent before anyone actually stopped moving. Reynolds looked at the desk officer, then at Danielle through the narrow interview room window, and for the first time that night his certainty fractured completely. What did you just say? The desk officer lowered the phone slightly. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is asking for Danielle Brooks. Caleb turned toward her so quickly that the red light on his body camera swept across the glass. Danielle did not smile. She did not look relieved. She simply stood beside the metal chair, one hand resting near the paper cup, watching Reynolds absorb the information he had refused to consider. She never identified herself as federal, Reynolds said. The desk officer looked at the receiver. They are sending someone here. Reynolds glanced at the sealed envelope in his hand and immediately placed it on the counter. The movement was small, but Caleb noticed how careful he had suddenly become. Less than 5 minutes later, headlights crossed the lobby windows. A dark sport utility vehicle stopped near the entrance, and 3 people in plain clothes stepped out into the wet night. Thomas Grant entered first. He was in his early 50s, gray beginning at his temples, dark overcoat still carrying droplets of rain. He walked directly to the desk, removed a credential case, and opened it without ceremony. Supervisory Special Agent Thomas Grant, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Nobody answered. Grant looked around the room. Where is Special Agent Brooks? The desk officer pointed toward the interview room. Reynolds stared at Danielle. Caleb stared too, but his expression was different. He looked less shocked by who she was than by how much suddenly made sense. Her precise language. The sealed envelope. The disposable phone. The repeated requests for a supervisor. The clock. Grant crossed the hallway and stopped in front of Danielle. Are you all right? Yes. Was the envelope opened? No. Was the phone accessed? No. Grant nodded once and turned toward Reynolds. Then hand over the bag. Reynolds hesitated for only a fraction of a second. Before giving it to him, Grant checked the envelope seal, looked inside without exposing the contents, and closed the zipper. Reynolds found his voice. If she had told us who she was, this would not have gone this far. Danielle stepped out of the interview room. The fluorescent light made the wet shoulders of her coat shine faintly. My vehicle came back clear. Reynolds said nothing. My license came back clear. The description did not match. Your officer told you the stop was falling apart. Caleb lowered his eyes. Reynolds looked toward him, then back at Danielle. You withheld critical information. Because I was working an active investigation. Then how was I supposed to know? Danielle held his gaze. You were supposed to know the facts you already had. The sentence settled over the room. Grant remained quiet, allowing the answer to stand on its own. Reynolds looked away. This was a misunderstanding. Danielle shook her head. A misunderstanding ends when new information corrects it. You kept going after the information stopped supporting you. Caleb looked at her, then at Reynolds. Grant turned toward him. Officer Morgan, was your body camera active throughout the detention? Yes, sir. At any point were you instructed to deactivate it? Caleb's face tightened. Reynolds immediately looked at him. For a second the younger officer seemed caught between the hierarchy he had walked into that night and the record he had chosen to preserve. Then he answered. Yes, sir. Grant's expression did not change. By whom? Caleb looked directly at Reynolds. Sergeant Reynolds. The lobby became very still. Reynolds stepped forward. That was a situational instruction. Grant raised one hand. You will have an opportunity to explain it through the proper process. Danielle looked at the small red light on Caleb's chest. It had been present through every question, every refusal, every warning, every attempt to turn uncertainty into guilt. Reynolds looked at Danielle again. You really want to make this into something bigger than it is? Danielle's voice stayed quiet. I do not know how big it is yet. Grant turned slightly toward her. What do you mean? Danielle looked at Caleb's camera, then at the sealed envelope, then finally at Reynolds. He tried to stop the recording before he knew who I was. Caleb understood first. His eyes shifted toward Reynolds. Danielle continued. The question is not what happened after he discovered I was federal. She paused. The question is how many times this happened when nobody important walked through the door afterward. Grant did not answer immediately. He looked from Danielle to Caleb, then toward Reynolds, whose expression had shifted from defensive certainty to something much harder to hide. Preserve the body camera file, Grant said. Do not copy it, edit it, or allow it to be overwritten. Caleb nodded. Yes, sir. The desk officer reached for the watch commander again, and within 20 minutes the station had changed from a routine late-night booking area into a place where every record suddenly mattered. Dispatch audio was flagged. Vehicle camera footage was secured. The convenience store was contacted about exterior surveillance. Reynolds stood near the far wall while instructions moved around him without waiting for his approval. You are treating me like I committed a crime, he said. Grant turned toward him. We are treating the evidence like evidence. Danielle watched Reynolds absorb the distinction. She felt no satisfaction. The adrenaline of the street had faded, leaving only exhaustion and the uncomfortable thought that kept returning, what if Caleb had switched the camera off? Professional standards arrived shortly after 1 in the morning. 2 investigators requested the incident report, Reynolds's recent camera logs, and any complaints involving disputed searches or recording failures. At first, the request covered only the current shift. Then one investigator frowned at the computer screen. There are multiple inactive camera notations under the same supervisor. Reynolds stepped closer. Equipment fails. Sometimes, the investigator replied. That is why we review patterns. Danielle remained silent as files began appearing on the screen. Different dates. Different neighborhoods. Different names. One complaint came from a black woman stopped 14 months earlier less than 2 miles from where Danielle had been detained. She had written that she repeatedly requested a supervisor after officers questioned the ownership of her own vehicle. The final report described her as uncooperative. Camera footage was listed as unavailable. Another complaint involved a black man whose recording ended shortly before a disputed search. A third involved a Latino college student. None of the files proved misconduct by themselves, and Grant said so clearly. We do not assume the conclusion. We follow the record. Danielle nodded. That is all I am asking. Caleb stood beside the conference table, reading the dates. I was not assigned to him for most of these. Danielle looked at him. Nobody said you were. He swallowed. But tonight I almost turned mine off. Almost matters less than what you chose. Caleb looked toward Reynolds through the glass wall of a nearby office. I should have challenged him sooner. Danielle answered quietly. Then remember that next time. At 2:15, Professional Standards formally took control of the internal review. Reynolds was relieved of street duties pending investigation, not as a declaration of guilt, but because the questions now extended beyond a single stop. He signed the required paperwork without looking at Danielle. As he prepared to leave the work area, he finally turned toward her. "You know this is going to follow me." Danielle held his gaze. "Records follow everyone. One bad night should not erase 20 years. Then 20 years of records should tell the full story." Reynolds looked away. For the first time, there was no argument ready behind his silence. He walked toward the administrative office, shoulders lower than they had been on the street. Caleb remained beside Danielle. On the table between them sat printed complaint summaries that had once belonged to strangers nobody in the room knew. Danielle touched none of them. She only read the names. "If your team had not noticed you were missing," Caleb said, "would anybody have opened these files?" Danielle looked at the stack for a long moment. "Probably not tonight." "That is hard to hear." "It should be." Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Pale reflections from the streetlights rested on the station windows. Danielle picked up her black bag, checked the sealed envelope, and handed it to Grant. The federal operation had survived. The people connected to it were still protected. But another investigation had begun, one Danielle had never expected to find. She looked once more at the old complaints. "Do not review these because of who I am," she told Grant. "Review them because of who they were." 3 months later, Danielle Brooks stood near the windows of the federal field office and watched early autumn sunlight settle across downtown Detroit. The Undercover case had survived the night at the station. The sealed envelope had remained secure, the surveillance operation continued, and the people connected to it were never exposed. But the other investigation had grown far beyond one traffic stop. Professional standards reviewed years of body camera records, dispatch logs, disputed searches, supervisor reports, and civilian complaints tied to Mark Reynolds. Some allegations could not be proven. Some records were incomplete. But enough patterns emerged to justify formal disciplinary findings for repeated policy violations, improper search decisions, failures to follow supervisory procedure, and attempts to interfere with required recording. Reynolds was removed from street duty and later reassigned while additional administrative action moved forward. The department also reopened several older complaints that had once ended quietly because footage was missing or testimony conflicted. For the people behind those complaints, there was no dramatic victory. There were phone calls, corrected reports, renewed interviews, and the unfamiliar experience of finally being taken seriously. Caleb Morgan remained on patrol. He submitted a complete statement about the night Danielle was detained, including the moment Reynolds ordered him to deactivate his body camera. Weeks later, Caleb asked Danielle to meet him for coffee near the federal building. He arrived early and sat near the window, turning a paper cup slowly between his hands. "I keep thinking about what would have happened if I had turned it off," he said. Danielle sat across from him. "Then remember why you did not." Caleb looked down. "I wish I had spoken sooner. Most people do, once the moment is over. That does not make it right." Danielle studied him for a second. "No. But what you do with that regret matters more than pretending you never hesitated." Caleb nodded. Outside, traffic moved steadily along the avenue. "I used to think loyalty meant standing behind your partner no matter what." Danielle looked through the glass. "Real loyalty sometimes means stopping someone before their worst decision becomes permanent." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Do you hate Reynolds?" Danielle shook her head. "No." "How?" "Because this was never supposed to become personal." She turned back toward him. "If I make it about whether he respected me because I work for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, then we miss the entire point." Caleb waited. Danielle continued. "He should have respected the facts before he knew my job. He should have respected procedure before he knew anyone important would ask questions. A badge behind my name should not have been the difference." Months passed. The department adopted stricter review requirements for interrupted body camera recordings and clearer supervisor notification procedures during disputed searches. Some officers complained that the new rules created more paperwork. Others quietly admitted that the rules protected them too, because a complete recording could defend good police work just as easily as it could expose bad decisions. Danielle never attended Reynolds's disciplinary meetings. She never waited outside to watch what happened to him. Justice, in her mind, was not a person being humiliated. It was a system becoming harder to ignore when someone said something was wrong. One morning, Grant met her near the elevators. A television in the lobby was showing a short local report about the reopened complaints. "They are calling the review a turning point," he said. Danielle pressed the elevator button. "Turning points are easy to announce." Grant looked at her. "And hard to prove." "They are proved by what happens when nobody is watching." The elevator had not arrived yet. Through the glass entrance, Danielle noticed an elderly black woman approaching a crosswalk with 2 grocery bags. A patrol car slowed and stopped well behind the line. The officer waited patiently while she crossed at her own pace. No confrontation. No audience. No reason for anyone to applaud. Danielle watched until the woman reached the sidewalk. Then the elevator doors opened behind her. Grant stepped inside. "Ready?" Danielle joined him. "Always." As the doors began to close, she thought about the woman from the 14-month-old complaint, the black man whose recording had ended too early, the college student whose questions had once been treated as disrespect, and all the people who had never had federal agents calling a station when they failed to come home on time. The lesson was simpler than any policy manual could make it: authority means more when it can be questioned, courage means more when it protects someone with less power, and justice means nothing if it only arrives after discovering that the person mistreated was important. The doors nearly met in the center. Danielle looked forward, calm as ever. One question remained, and it belonged to everyone who heard the story. If she had been an ordinary black woman with no federal credentials, no secure check-in, and nobody powerful coming through that station door, how long would it have taken before someone believed her?